President Xi not coming to the G20 summit, is that actually a big deal? And is there an investor impact?
It's a very big deal to not have President Xi coming to the G20. It's not only the first time he's skipped a G20 summit, it's the first time any Chinese leader, going back to his predecessor, Hu Jintao, has skipped a G20 leader summit. Why it matters for investors, why it matters for markets. If the world's second largest economy is going to disengage in some way from the G20, it might not have a direct impact on this G20 in India, but remember when we need the G20, the global financial crisis, when they agreed to coordinated fiscal stimulus of $5 trillion, the outbreak of COVID and the health policies and the coordinated actions they took. You need the G20 together when there's a crisis. And if we get into a situation and we don't have China's full engagement and support for that institution, we could really feel the impacts of that down the road.
So, Josh, you said something pretty interesting. You said he's snubbing the G20. So is this a snub of the organization, or is this in any way directed at President Biden?
I don't think it's directed at President Biden directly. They will likely see each other in a few short months at APEC. I think it has much more to do with how China views the role of the G20, how China views their role in the G20. And remember, it comes on the heels of the BRICS expansion just 2 weeks ago. And I think you have to read those two things together and say China is looking for alternative multilateral channels. That doesn't mean they won't be involved in the G20. The premier is going, but they are trying to send a signal that they are not convinced that this is the only way to do international economic multilateralism. So it's less to do about the U.S. and more to do about the global economic institutions more broadly.
So, Josh, you're bringing up the BRICS. It's interesting. So this year, the G20 is actually in a BRICS nation, India. Next year, Brazil, another BRICS nation. I want to talk about something we don't probably talk about enough on this show, currency. Looking at the dollar, up about 2% in the second half of the year. Do you expect some conversations about the dollar being the reserve currency and the BRICS nations, at least currency discussions?
Yeah, I think the way to think about that issue is that it won't be discussed directly. Currency isn't on the agenda, but it's in the background of the G20 when it comes to the use of sanctions, right? This is a frustration for the non-G7 countries, the non-Western advanced economies, thinking of how the dollar and the euro, from their view, have been weaponized over the past 18 months when we think of sanctions against Russia. And they are thinking in the back of their minds, my foreign exchange reserves, what would happen if I got crossed with the West in some way? That is a backdrop to the meetings. It is not a theme of the meetings, but you have to think about it. And the U.S. is thinking about it. And where they come at the table is saying, yes, we do use sanctions when there's violations of international norms or an invasion of another sovereign country. But what we are bringing to the table is what they call positive economic statecraft. We want to reform the World Bank. We want to modernize and revitalize the IMF. There was a speech yesterday from Treasury about that. So the U.S. response is basically saying, we hear your concerns, and we want to talk about the positive aspect of U.S. financial leadership.
All right, Josh, one other quick question. Again, the G20 is in India this year. India actually very recently became the world's third largest economy. A lot of U.S. companies moving manufacturing there. Apple's a great example of that. What are you expecting from the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi? We mentioned he might flex his muscles. How could he do so, and is there an investor impact to that?
Well, this is a huge moment for India. They've invested so much in this G20 beyond which most countries put into their G20 summits. It's been a national event over the past year. And I think where you're going to see the most sort of international market implication, international financial, is on what they do on climate change adaptation. There's going to be major new commitments agreed to at this summit and then following on in COP in November. And that's what they want, and India wants to be a major takeaway of this summit. I expect some big numbers to be put on the table over the next 48 hours.